Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 24th of October. My name is Maggie Lennon, there I am. And I'll start the programme as usual with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, 2,403 newly confirmed cases of COVID-19 were reported in Scotland. There were no new reported deaths of people who tested positive, but that often happens at the weekend. 4,302,382 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,890,477 have received their second dose. 896 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 61 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 622,836 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and sadly 9,031 patients who had tested positive have died. I'm joined today by SNP MP for Glasgow North West, Carol Monaghan, and Green activist, artist, holistic therapist and craft maker, Sam Paton. Good afternoon to you both. I hope you're well.
Hello.
Hi Maggie, how are you doing?
Good. We're going to start sticking with the COVID story just now. Our cases in Scotland seem to have plateaued around about the 2,500 mark a day, which seems a bit strange, because if you look at the graph before that, it was coming down pretty steadily. It's not quite sure why it's plateaued. And although we are well under the sort of anticipated 10% of UK cases a day, we are higher than 10% of UK deaths a day or admissions to intensive care. So that's a slight concern because it suggests that there's something going on there. Now, I'm wondering if either of you think, Sam, do you think that's something to do with the kind of general poor health of certain groups in Scotland, or why do you think our deaths seem higher than they statistically should be?
I really don't know. I don't feel qualified to answer that, Maggie, because at the end of the day, I've got no medical, education. But just as a general member of the public out and about working, I mean, there seems to be a kind of lax in preventative measures. I mean, as much as you're still seeing a lot of people wearing face masks, round about here, round about Loch Lomond area, there is not as many people wearing face masks now. And that's quite concerning. And even in the shops, you're not seeing as many shopkeepers wearing face masks. And you're not also seeing, way before at the beginning of the pandemic and right up until recently, when you went into a shop, there would be a table there with hand sanitizer, and things like that there for people walking in and out of shops. You're not seeing that as much now. So it seems to be people are being a wee bit more complacent. I don't know about other areas in Scotland. I can only comment in my own area. So I think part of it is people are becoming a bit more complacent. And people with health issues are going to struggle more than people who are healthy. But the thing is, with COVID, we all know it affects the healthy just as much as it affects people who are vulnerable, because it's the long-term issues that we're still finding out about. So I think there needs to be a wee bit of a drive, just to kind of reinstate how important it is for people using preventative measures like the face masks, like the using hand sanitizer and social distancing. The amount of times I've been in a shop and people are standing right up close to you and they don't even wear a face mask.
Yeah, I was in a supermarket yesterday and someone was right up my back in the queue, and I did turn around and say, "Could you just take a step or two back, please?"
Yeah.
Apart from anything, it wasn't, there was personal space. I should say that although our deaths are running at higher than the sort of 10% statistical average of deaths in the UK, obviously they're much, much lower than they were at the beginning of the year when we were showing the same kind of percentage of cases. And while it's plateaued in Scotland, in England, Carol, it's getting worse. The cases are rising quite dramatically. I think we were over 500,000 for the first time in ages. I was quite struck when I was looking at photographs and pictures in Westminster that it would appear that the Tory benches are not wearing masks at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost entirely non-mask wearing on the Tory benches. There's probably a couple of them that are sticking with masks, but generally they just don't wear them. And I mean, if you think about the reasons for wearing masks, the main reason is that we do not introduce aerosols from our breath into the atmosphere. So masks will, even a basic mask will stop these aerosols. So I'm actually wearing a mask to protect other people. And it kind of tells you a little bit about the mentality of the Tory benches, that they don't see that that's something they should be doing. So yeah, it's quite worrying. But I would also say there's a real difference. I know we are seeing people in shops and on public transport in Scotland without masks. When you go to London, it's widespread. People are just not wearing masks. So I think that's one reason why we're seeing the increased numbers in England. The other reason is that they are way behind Scotland in terms of vaccination of young people. And we're now at over 50% of our 12 to 15-year-olds have had one dose, whereas it's about 12% in England. Now, in England, they're only doing them in schools. They're not doing them in drop-in centres. Which means, and what we're also seeing is anti-vaxxers targeting schools, giving out literature outside schools, and it allows them to contact kids directly. Whereas in Scotland, where we're letting young people have their vaccinations in drop-in centres as well, there's less opportunity for them
That's
to kind
quite
of
worrying that you're
get to
saying
kids.
that anti-vaxxers are allowed to stand outside school gates and hand out literature. That's quite worrying for a whole raft of reasons.
Well, I don't know if it's quite outside schools, but they certainly seem to be targeting school children. So, and I've got to say, actually, even my own kids have come home from school with anti-vax materials that's been handed to them. So I don't think that particular aspect is unique to England. What I was able to do, though, when I got it, when they showed me what they were handed, I was able to go through the different points and explain why that wasn't the case, or look at alternative sources of information. And we used it as an opportunity for a discussion. And we still took our kids for their vaccination, and they had the choice of whether to have it or not, and both of mine decided to have it. But if it's only been done in school, I'm not sure that the parents can then have those kind of grown up and informed conversations with the kids if the vaccine's just been done there. So I think that's something they need to look at in England.
And Boris Johnson seems absolutely determined that he's not going to introduce Plan B, that there's not going to be reintroducing the mandatory wearing of face masks, which is the case in Scotland and not the case in England. And that seems, in the light of these increasing figures, slightly careless. But the other side of that is people are now beginning to mutter that, there might be a further lockdown for Christmas. I would have thought if there was any suggestion that families were not going to see each other again this Christmas, there'd be riots in the street, I would have imagined. So what do you think might happen in England? Do you think they will introduce masks? What's the chat in Westminster, if there is any, about this subject?
I mean, there's different chats, and it's kind of it varies depending on who you speak to. Some of the Tories are getting quite concerned about the numbers, but they don't want to be the ones seen to be wearing a mask on the bench. I think there's a real opportunity for individual Tory MPs to show a bit of leadership and put their masks on. We know that wearing a mask is inconvenient. We know it can be uncomfortable, but it is a tiny measure if you consider the other things we're able to do just now, just by simply wearing a mask. I don't want to have another Christmas like last year. So if that means I have to wear a mask when I'm out in public for the next few months, then so be it. And I think people need to be kind of realistic and sensible about this.
Sam, with the increasing high death rate, especially when you look at the whole of the UK figures, do you think we're becoming a bit desensitised to that? I mean, I even find when I read out the figures for Scotland, it's just reading out a figure, really. And do you think because there have been so many people have died that we've kind of passed that point of shock, and actually people just go, oh, well, another 100 deaths, 200 deaths in the UK, just sort of shrug their shoulders, and is that part of the problem?
I think it is, Maggie. I agree with you there. I think we have become desensitised to the amount of deaths that's happening with COVID, and we seem to be accepting it, and that's the sad fact. And the thing is, we've all know somebody who has either lost somebody, or we have lost somebody through COVID or COVID related complications, and there, yeah, and I think, while we're desensitized to this and to the numbers, nothing's going to change because it's become normal, and we need to change that, and we need to start getting a wee bit more mindful of the fact that this is people's lives, this is people's families, this is people's health, and and maybe we need to take a different approach from thinking about the long-term effects, because if our kids get COVID, there was a report that came out the other day, and they were talking about how it affects certain brain cells, especially in children, and it could actually increase the chance of early onset dementia when kids get older, as they get older, and they were looking into this. So this report's still, it's at the early stages, but this is things that we need to look at in terms of COVID. It's not just what happens here and now in the next month or two, it's what's going to happen down the line. Especially with our children when they start growing up, especially with if they get COVID lung and things like that as well. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on society as a whole, in terms of the workforce and the welfare system. So maybe, if people are not being, being complacent in terms of wearing face masks and so forth, maybe we should start kind of taking it from a different angle and start thinking about the long-term effects of COVID.
Well, one of the angles about COVID, one of the angles about COVID that we can't really ignore is the fact that Glasgow's about to have descended upon its 25,000 delegates, and goodness knows how many journalists and activists and all sorts coming for COP26. And there's some concern in the city that actually that's going to make the cases in Glasgow certainly rise and across the whole of Scotland. So there's some concern about a COVID spike, but obviously that's not the only thing that is going to impact on life, especially in Glasgow from next weekend when the conference starts in earnest, although fringe events are starting from, I think, Friday this week. We've already had to experience road closures in the city, which some have started already. And the big news, of course, is that the RMT union have called a national strike and are claiming that there'll be no trains running in Scotland at all from the 31st of October or the 1st of November through to the 12th of November. I don't know if that affects, I don't imagine that will affect trains that are coming from down south, but it's going to have a huge impact on how people get about the country. So I was wondering, Carol, do you think that there's been some suggestion that the RMT have not really handled this very well, that they haven't really taken seriously the offers that have been made to them by the employer, and that they've kind of rejected them out of hand? Now, obviously, you use an event like COP26 where Scotland is being showcased. It's sort of part of the negotiation. We're going to make a mess of that and demand that we get our way. So it's not an unusual technique. But do you think there's something else going on here? Do you think it's a deliberate attempt to embarrass Scotland, make us look a bit like we're back in the 1970s? Or are there concerns genuine? They have been striking on Sundays since way back in March over the same conditions, and nothing's really been done about it. So what's your take on the rail strikes that we're going to see in Scotland?
Yeah, I think first of all, people will use an opportunity that presents itself, and clearly COP presents an opportunity. What's important though, and I think it's important for any employee considering industrial action, is what you hope to get out of it, and can you bring other people on board? Are you going to win hearts and minds? Because hearts and minds mean a lot, because with public support you can get a lot of things done. I'm not sure that this will win public support. We already know that there's going to be road closures. We've been encouraged to use public transport instead during COP. But if people are struggling to get to their work or get their kids to school, I think you run the risk of actually creating bad feeling and not not getting that kind of support on side that you're hoping to do. So I think this, I mean, it's going to be difficult for us, this strike. I think we're all going to feel it. We're already feeling road closures, but I think potentially they could actually lose the goodwill of the public here.
Sam, one of the things that people have been coming out and saying in the last few days is actually the Scottish Government need now to intervene. And you often hear this in a strike situation. You often hear it when businesses go bust. The government must intervene. But really, should the government intervene? Should they kowtow to these demands just because we've got a major event coming up in Scotland and it would look a bit embarrassing? Or does government take the view, well, they are not, obviously the railways will be going back into public ownership, but not to next year. So the Scottish Government will effectively be the employer, but they're not at the moment. So should they just sit back and let them sort it out, or should they make some sort of extra offer to make sure that the trains run during COP26?
I think this is one of those ones where the Scottish Government are damned if they do and damned if they don't. It doesn't matter what they do, it's going to be wrong. You know, at the end of the day, people are going to, as Carol had pointed out, they're going to take the opportunity. COP26 is coming along. You know, if you're going to want to make demands and demand better working conditions for any sector, you know, this is the best time, the best opportunity to do it when Scotland's, you know, sitting in the world stage at the moment. So I think it's a tough one with the Scottish Government right now, because the trains will be going back into public ownership, you know, next year. So it is a really, really difficult one. And I wouldn't like to be sitting in their seat right now, because, as I say, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. But surely, as the hosts of COP26, who are Westminster, should have made sure that things like the public transport system is going to be able to cope, and it's going to be accessible for everybody. All these things should have been put in place before, as part of the preparations up to COP26. And as the hosts of COP26, this is the kind of prep work that Westminster should have put in place and done. But we all know that.
So are you saying that?
Westminster,
so you're saying that Westminster should intervene in the rail strike then and make some
Yes,
extra
I think
offer?
they should. I think they should, because at the end of the day, they're the hosts of COP26, and they're the ones that are wanting COP26 to be in Glasgow. So I think they need to burden some of the responsibility when it comes to the public transport in Scotland.
I think it might be playing into
Glasgow.
I think it might be playing into Westminster's hand, though, to make it look like a bit of an embarrassment for Scotland. Carol, let's just think.
They could.
Carol, let's just think about this whole idea then of Scotland's impact on the world stage and Scotland's chance to shine. We are being sidelined, though, aren't we, about the whole COP26? I mean, the whole thing about whether Nicola would be able to go to any of it or host anything. I don't know if that's been resolved yet. I haven't heard. But also the fact that the most recent kind of slap in the face, environmental slap in the face, was the fact that the carbon capture projects which have been announced have not included the main one in Scotland that we were convinced was going to be funded. So is Scotland, despite the fact it's the showcase, despite the fact COP26 is happening here, do you think we are being sidelined on the world stage on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, there's without a doubt the UK government have done everything they can to exclude the Scottish government from any sort of preparations and discussions and logistics surrounding COP. So very definitely. I mean, it's really what we expect, but to do it so publicly. And let's just be clear, the reason that Glasgow was chosen was not because it was any sort of love bomb or anything from Westminster. It was chosen because it was a city that had the infrastructure and the ability, the services there of a size that could accommodate it. Now, if you think of the delegates and the thousands of people that will be there and the security issues and everything else, it would be very difficult to host COP in London because it's difficult to shut off the way Glasgow's going to be shut off. But this is going to have a huge impact, not just on people trying to get to the work and school or whatever else, but also local businesses. And I've been shouting about what's happening with local businesses. Local businesses still don't have clarity over what sort of compensation they might get for having to close during COP. So if they're within the kind of red zone or green zone, but the inner zone, they will not be able to open unless they're a hotel, but other businesses won't be able to open during COP, and they don't know what sort of support they're getting. So they've already been hit with issues around COVID. Now they're trying to get back on their feet, and COP that might present an opportunity, a business opportunity for them, has been taken away. So we've got local businesses crying out for help and crying out for clarity on this, and the UK government, it's complete silence. In fact, what they do say is, oh yes, you will have some details of the compensation package provided to you, but here we are days away from COP and we still don't have it. So everybody has been sidelined by this, local businesses, members of the public, Scottish Government. I get constituents contacting me annoyed about what is happening and demanding that I take action, and it's pretty difficult, the very little I can do whenever all these decisions have been taken without any kind of attempt to work with local elected representatives here in Glasgow or in Scotland to try and see the best way forward. So it has been extremely frustrating.
And on top of that, the tabloids are screaming this morning about the risks of terrorism. And I mean, let's face it, you're going to bring, 200 world leaders together. And if you were minded to cause some mischief, this would be the time to do it. And although I appreciate security is going to be extremely tight, I do think that is a bit of a concern for local people. But I don't want to scaremonger, but it is something that needs to be considered. I mean, I guess it would all be fine and people would be quite happy to put up with this if we feel that this is going to actually achieve something. But increasingly, it appears to be being undermined even before it started. So this week we heard about the leak of the report that Saudi Arabia, amongst others, were trying to downplay the importance of fossil fuels. Big meat producing countries were trying to downplay the desire for people to turn to a more plant-based diet. China and Russia will not be there, despite the fact they're the world's biggest polluters. And you do wonder what's going to be achieved. And on the other side of that, the UN have come out in a kind of quite uncharacteristic, fairly strong statement this week, saying that world conflict and chaos could be the result of a summit failure. And they're talking about massive impact of climate change on food security, and that resulting in massive movements of people and a migration crisis. And it's talking about instability across the world, a rise in violence and a rise in terrorism. So, Sam, it's fair to say that the stakes could not be any higher. And as someone who's a well-known green activist, just if you can fairly succinctly tell us what you expect and what your hopes are coming out of this meeting.
I'm afraid that I'm not very hopeful regarding this meeting of COP26. I would like to say the opposite, but unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of sound bites, a lot of empty promises, a lot of, even if you just look at what Westminster's promising, there's a lot of, they're talking about zero emissions, they're talking about, climate change, they're talking about, all these wonderful things that they've got to talk about regarding COP26. But when you see what they have got in the pipeline, you have got HS2, you've got the Campbell oil field, you have the Cumbria coal mine, and you've got all these things. Now, there is no way we can take COP26 when the host themselves is not taking it seriously, and that's the problem. And so to me, there seems to be a lot of high stakes. Glasgow's been put at risk, Scotland's been put at risk in terms of COVID, in terms of terrorism, and businesses, the local economy, everything is being put at risk. And they're talking about, our climate crisis, which is a really serious thing. It's affecting communities right across the world. People are being displaced from their homes, people are losing their lives, and yet your host is still going ahead with a possible Cumbria coal mine, the HS2, and they're talking about the Campbell oil field. And never mind, on top of that, they're talking about the London Resort, which is some of the areas are triple SI status. So how can we take this serious? And I'm very, very sceptical about what's going to be said at the COP26, I'm afraid.
Carol, I have to admit, I am getting increasingly a bit fed up with the narrative from young people that it's all our fault, it's all my generation's fault, and it's their future that's being ruined, blah, blah, blah. I mean, when I was the age of Greta Thunberg, for example, I didn't have mum and dad drive me to school. I walked to school. I used glass milk bottles. I wasn't personally responsible for the introduction of Tetra Pak and plastic cartons and all the other things that have happened. And Greta Thunberg has been extremely critical, not just of the Scottish Government, but she's critical of every politician who walks the earth, has come out this week. And I think she's sounding increasingly naive and a bit just not in touch with reality, really. She's saying that it's not about politicians, which as a politician, maybe you take some umbrage at, but it's about people. People have to take back control. People have to uproot the system. The system, she's right in one respect, is she not? It's actually not a lot to do with politicians. The reason we are in this climate mess is because of the drivers of industry and business. And it's been like that since the Industrial Revolution. And that is driven by self-interest. So all the things that have made life easier, more convenient, that have driven climate change, the development of plastics and all the rest of it, the drive towards greater oil and gas production to make us warmer and more comfortable, isn't really done by politicians, it's done by business. So when she says she wants to uproot the system, do you agree? Do you think that's what needs to happen? And what kind of uprooting do you think she's talking about? And do you actually think people are, when it comes down to it, that interested? Is self-interest not drive us all? And we're really concerned about what's happening to us in the near future. And we're not very good as a race thinking into the future. Oh, we've lost your sound, Carol. I don't know if we can...
Hello, sorry.
That's it,
Is
right.
that better?
Yes.
Apologies, I had to mute myself. There was noise in my kitchen, so
Okay.
sorry about that. There's so many different threads in what you've just said, and all of us as individuals, politicians, members of the public, whoever we are, we all know that the biggest crisis facing humanity is climate change. End of. So is that forcing individuals to take responsibility for their actions? Wouldn't it be great if everybody said, I'm not going to fly anymore, I'm not going to drive to the shops or drive my kids to school, I'm not going to use things that include plastics, that would be fabulous. But the fact is, if I want to take plastics out of my daily life, I need to look for alternatives, and often it's very difficult to find alternatives, and often these alternatives are expensive. So even if I want to be responsible, it's difficult. But we know that things only change because of laws that are in place. They've changed from single-use plastic bags to reusable bags only happened because we legislated in Scotland and we put a tariff on plastic bags. So we might know as individuals what we should and shouldn't be doing, but it's only when we get actual legislation being pushed that things change. So Greta is, in an ideal world, we'd all be doing everything properly. I get that. But this, unfortunately, our lives are never ideal. So we do need governments to show leadership. And I just want to link back to something else that you said, about different countries that are not going to be present at COP, and whether anything good is going to be able to come out of it. I think we have to just accept there will be some that will buy into and some that won't buy into. What we need to do is make sure that here in Scotland and in the UK, and everybody at this COP shows leadership and shows global leadership. That puts pressure on the countries that are not doing this. In the same way that I'm still wearing my mask in Westminster, although all the Tories are not, because I know that's the right thing to do, and we show a bit of leadership there. So we need to be ambitious in terms of what we're doing with climate. We have to be ambitious personally, but we do have to be ambitious in politics as well, in terms of legislation to move towards net zero and look at pollution things. And frankly, and I will be critical, the UK government's miles away from this, but I think even the Scottish government needs to be more ambitious, and possibly that's one of the good things that will come out of COP.
So you think that possibly this the whole critical mass of all these countries sitting down and looking at what they agreed in Paris 6 years ago and what they're going to agree now might actually encourage some of that braver thinking and more ambitious thinking, and that even if that's all that happens of COP, it's worth it then.
I don't think it'll come about because of, wholesome thoughts or responsible politics, whatever. I think it'll come out of by necessity. Some of the things that you spoke about in your introduction to this section, there's a real sort of, our resources are so limited, and there's going to be more and more, they're going to become more and more acutely sought after. So when we have that situation, that's going to force action. It should be happening now, though. We really need to take action. We needed to take action 40 years ago. We need to take it now. And so if we can't get this right at COP, we seriously have problems globally.
That puts me in mind of quite a famous African proverb which says the best time to plant a tree is today, the second best time was yesterday. And I kind of think that's what you're saying. Sam, Saudi Arabia have just come out this week and said that, I think it's the first statement they've made on any sort of emissions targets, that they will aim to be net zero by 2060. Now, we should point out that's a good 10 years behind most of their neighbours and other major polluting countries. But they've also said in the same breath that they don't see that means they have to cut back on the production of fossil fuels, of oil and gas at all. So the way these things work, they may cut their own emissions in their country by cutting back methane or whatever, or possibly offsetting, which a lot of green activists think is a bit of a con. But because whoever buys the oil and gas from Saudi and then burns it, they carry, if you like, the emissions penalty with that. It does kind of mean that Saudi Arabia can carry on, as can all oil producers, developing oil fields, delivering oil and gas to the world, because that, if you like, they're kind of offshoring their own emissions. So is this kind of gesture politics from Saudi Arabia? Do you think it has any meaning at all?
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. There's so much I would love to say about that, but not appropriate for this time in the day. The thing is, it's, if that was the case, every country in the world who's oil producing and using fossil fuels could use that argument, and we're never going to get anywhere. We're just going round in circles, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And what can I say? It's, if that's their attitude, hopefully they will be shamed into different thinking by the other countries in the world. But time will tell. That's all I can say on that one. Time will tell. 2060, that's such a long time away. So much can happen between now and 2060. So, yeah, time's going to tell with that one. But it's a great way of thinking, isn't it? Not.
Well, if I'm still here, I'll be 100. So that's how long away it is. Sadly, it isn't just under issues of climate and environment that Scotland seems to be getting sidelined by the Westminster government. We were talking on the programme earlier this week about the impact of the New Zealand trade deal, on top of the impact of the Australian trade deal that we know is possibly going to impact negatively on Scottish farmers and crofters, and yet Scotland wasn't included in any of the consideration or the negotiation. The next one that seems to be getting manipulated sort of behind closed doors is the so-called UK Shared Prosperity Fund. This is the money which from 2023, although there is money available now, but from 2023 will replace the structural funds money that Britain got from the EU. So the money that we used to give away to the EU, we keep and will be part of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. We've been getting told for quite some time that it would not, unlike the current structural funds, be managed by devolved administrations. Now, there may be actually quite good reasons for that, but we're not really sure. No one really knows how it's going to be distributed, what the criteria is going to be. Some of the Share Prosperity Fund is being delivered at the moment. It's being administered. There are pilots. I believe local authorities, including some in Scotland, have been given some money. But one of the big announcements just today, I think, or yesterday, was that a big new national project to promote numeracy is going to benefit 500,000 adults in the UK. Because it's not going to be administered by devolved administrations, and because, according to the Scottish Secretary for State, Jack, the money is going to go directly to communities, Carol, the big concern is how do we know it's going to get to the right communities and who's going to decide that? Could this be a way of that money being, if you like, unionised and used for perhaps pet Tory projects rather than going to communities of real need, which is what structural funds really support at the moment? So, for example, the City of Glasgow, as you'll know, gets a huge pot of that money because of the levels of social deprivation in the city. Is it being much discussed in Westminster?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it. Of course, the EU funds that this has been set up supposedly to replace, you've got to remember that a lot of the funding that came for the development of, for example, roads around the Highlands or community centres in rural areas came from EU funds that would never have been funded by the Tory government because it was too far away. Why did they care about such things? But that was one of the real benefits to Scotland from EU membership, was that actually local groups could identify this was an area of need and could get funding for that. So there is a real worry actually about how this is going to be managed. Already we're hearing about, it's because of the strength of the union, this money can come to Scotland, etc., etc. We need to remember this is our money. This is, we're not going to get more than our share. So it's our taxes paid into Westminster coffers that are going to be coming back to Scotland, but they're going to be coming back to Scotland with a Union Jack emblazoned on them, and for projects that maybe the local community don't actually want or wouldn't support or are not the best use of funds in that area. So yeah, there is a real concern. Clearly, if money's coming to Scotland, we will take that money, but it would be far more of far greater value if it was the communities themselves that decided what were the greatest needs for them and how structural funds could be spent.
Yeah, so it's not at all clear what role sort of geographical areas will have, or indeed local authorities. And you said we'll get our share, but there's been some concern that because for years, just because of the rules around ESF funding in particular, large cities in England like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool were not eligible for that money, and that the Shared Prosperity Fund has been seen as a way by the UK government of allowing these big powerhouses, these northern powerhouses, that it's in the Conservative government's interest to keep on side, might get a lot of that money. So actually it's quite possible that Scotland won't get its full share that's expected. Again, is that something that is getting much traction in Westminster?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something that we're going to have to be keeping a really close eye on. We need to know how money has been spent. The difficulty, as always, is getting that message out to people in Scotland that actually we are due more than this, or we've been underfunded for whatever reason. As you know, the getting these messages out in Scottish media can be very difficult, but obviously you're doing your bit here, Maggie, so keep up the good work.
We're going to move now into a slightly more domestic story, and one that's been extremely concerning. And this is the news over the last 2 weeks or so, that a number of women in nightclubs, mostly in England, have been reporting that they've been getting spiked, not through drinks, which sadly is all too common, but by through needles, having needles injected into them, carrying something that has made them extremely unwell. It's been taken fairly seriously by police forces across England, and indeed the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has asked for an urgent update on just how widespread this practice is and what police forces are doing about it. Sadly, however, there's been almost a bit of a backlash. So-called experts, and I'm afraid to say the only experts I've read have been men, but that's maybe being unfair, are now beginning to question whether any of this is possible. Apparently it would be extremely difficult to give someone a shot in the arm without them noticing. No one's saying these women that have complained haven't noticed that they've had a pain in their arm. What they're saying is the impact is so quick that within a very short period afterwards, they're comatose, and out of it, people just assume they're drunk. And we know what happens when people think women are drunk. So this, Sam, is yet another impact on women. It's yet another case of violence against women and girls. And what are we being told all the time? Cover your drinks. Don't leave your drink unattended. Make sure a friend looks after it if you go to the toilet. Once again, victimising the victims. But what the heck do we do if we're worried that some maniac with a needle is going to stick it in your arm?
This is the thing, it really annoys me, Maggie. It's about putting the onus on the victim, about them having to do everything to protect themselves instead of dealing with the fact is that there's people out there, I'm not just going to say it's men, it could be women as well, but there's people out there who are actively going out of their way to harm other people when they're in a vulnerable situation. At the end of the day, when you're in a nightclub, you're in a pub, you let your guard down, you're enjoying yourself, you're with your friends, and there is people who, with nasty intentions, for whatever reason, are taking advantage of that. And yes, we grew up in the days of when we went clubbing, you always walked about with your hand over a glass or your thumb on the bottle, and you never ever left your drink on its own. And if you were going to the toilet, you left it with a friend. And these were things that were drummed into us when we were going out and about. And to think in this day and age that women are still having to behave like that, but also now that they've got the fear of somebody actually injecting them. Now, my question would be now when I was younger, going into nightclubs, and especially nightclubs, you were searched. You were patted down by a female and your bag was searched. Well, that was for women. Men were patted down by a fellow man bouncer. So how is somebody getting by with a needle?
Well, there's a shortage of bouncers. And I hadn't realised this, but apparently, there is a shortage of bouncers. This is one of the latest shortages that have been announced.
Really?
And there's a shortage of security staff. So that might be part of it.
Is this to do with the fact that they find it difficult to get people licensed for their badges?
Yes, I think so. And I think it may be that quite a lot of bouncers were people from other parts of Europe. So there is a shortage of bouncers in some of our cities and general security staff.
But surely...
And women's groups are also complaining that bar staff and nightclub staff are not getting the training they need in how to deal with reports of this kind of sexual violence or violence. So I think there's a wider context here. But what I'm really concerned about is these experts who are telling us, well, it's not very likely that it's happening, possibly all men. What are they saying? Are they saying these women are lying? I mean, how bad does it have to get before women are being taken seriously about this new threat?
This is the problem with a lot of men in our society, is they have this attitude that women, there's still this attitude around women of being hysterical and a bit, a wee bit of a drama queen, and this needs to stop. It really needs to stop. When women are saying that they are in danger, they are in danger. And the thing is, it's so possible to go up and inject somebody and you wouldn't notice. I mean, did you think that going up and injecting somebody, you're going to turn around and say, sit down at the bar, give me your arm, and I'm going to give you, it's going to a wee injection and you might feel a slight prick and it might be a wee bit sore and that's it. These things don't happen. Somebody could easily walk by you and just stab a needle into you. And if it's an EpiPen, that's designed to go in even quicker. So these experts need to get their head out the sand and actually start deciding and actually looking into it and actually deciding and finding out what's going on. Is it EpiPens that are being filled with an alternative drug from what it should be? And is this what's going on? And they need to find out what people are being injected with instead of just making out that the women are making it up.
I don't know what the timescale is on Priti Patel's request for additional information, but obviously we will keep an eye on this story and see.
It's Priti Patel.
Well, but she has asked, so give the women her due. So we'll keep an eye on this and see. But it's interesting. It's not just happening in one area. I mean, it's happening across cities in England. So either women are making this all up to, because they're hysterical attention grabbers, or it's actually
Definitely
a new
not.
attack on women. On a more positive story for women, however, this week sees the Scottish Women and Girls in Sport Week starts Monday 25th to August the 31st. And this is aimed at showcasing women and girls projects across Scotland and highlight the role models and increased participation of women in sport. Carol, this is hugely important, isn't it? And a great initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. Maggie, can I just ask a wee favour before I continue? My old hairdresser, I'm saying old, she's not old at all, she's very young, who's an absolute marvellous woman, moved to Hong Kong and left me without a hairdresser, but Sarah Ann's listening in from Hong Kong today, so can I say a quick hello to Sarah Ann in Hong Kong?
Very welcome. Hello, Sarah Ann. Welcome from Hong Kong. We're truly international.
Oh, she'll be delighted with that, Maggie. Thanks very much. But yeah, one of the big issues we have with women and girls in sport is they hit adolescence. They might be really involved in their sport, but they hit adolescence. They go through physical changes. They've start becoming more self-conscious, and often at that point drop out of sport and consider it not to be something for them. And what we know actually is sport is so good for young women's mental health, physical health, so many benefits for them, and it's something we need to encourage them to continue. And it's great to see, for example, the success of the women's football team, Scottish women's football team. These women are brilliant role models for young girls. So we need to see more of that. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there are other sports that girls are involved in. It might be dancing, it might be gymnastics. And I know these are typically girls type activities, but we need to find ways of continuing them in these sports whenever they start becoming more self-conscious about, their bodies or about their participation. And I do want to I'm giving another shout out to Kingston Gymnastics Club, and Kingston Gymnastics Club is what's called an acrobatics gymnastics club, and acrobatics allows kids to work in pairs or trios, and when the girls start going through the changes and their bodies start developing, they don't need to stay stick thin as is traditionally thought of in these in like gymnastics. They can develop into young women and they can have a different position in that trio. They maybe move from being the wee one in top that's thrown about to be one of the girls in the bottom, and it's really, really good for teamwork, for just their involvement and their self-confidence. It's a great sport, and it really, really worth doing. But we need to look at other ways that the girls are involved. And so yes, let's see more role models. The final thing I'll say, Maggie, is if you look at any newspaper and turn to the sports page, if you're lucky, you'll see one woman. Yeah, that's not because there's only one woman doing sport.
Yeah, I'm just writing down on my notes. More coverage is needed, and more money is needed put into women in sport. In another lifetime, I used to be the editor of the Weekend Scotsman, and I was on staff at the Scotsman the first year that Leslie Riddick, who was also on the editorial board, created the first Scotswoman. And I flew the sports pages for that day. I used to write a sports column for Scotland on Sunday from a women's point of view. And I flew the sports pages that day. They were very different from normal because they focused on a lot of sports that women are involved in, and also picked up for the first time the whole zero tolerance against violence against women. At that point, football clubs were behind. And it felt like it was a real breakthrough, but I'm afraid back then it was just one day. So disgusted was the sports editor with my handling of the paper that day on his pages. He didn't turn up to work. So it
Yeah,
still needs
can
it needs it needs a bit more work, I think. Certainly more coverage,
also
more money.
Yeah, can also add, see if you look at the sports pages, you would think that no women are doing sport. And we know that every weekend there are women out doing sport on the international stage as well, not just nationally, but internationally. There's women doing sport every single weekend. And if you look at sports pages, you would think it was only men. In fact, you would think it was only very well paid footballers that were taking part in sport. There's so much more to it, and we need to see that reflected.
Especially when our very well paid footballers, when they're wearing the national shirt, are often not as good as they could be. I'm just going to end the show with an update on a story that's been all over the press this week, and that is the accidental and fatal shooting on Alec Baldwin's film set for the film Rust. Those of us, I have family who work in the film industry. I'm very well aware that film sets are dangerous places, and that very often the pressures of time and money mean that shortcuts get taken. Only in the last 24 hours, people who were working on set have now come forward and said they'd expressed concerns about safety on set. They'd expressed concerns about the use of prop guns. Apparently, 2 other unexpected discharges from the gun that killed the cinematographer had happened. In the United States, crew and creatives are much more highly unionised than they are in the UK. This often becomes an issue when you get crews working together, especially on the big Netflix, Amazon, HBO shows. But we know that crews work very long hours. They often work day shifts followed by a week of night shifts, back to day shifts. And as I say, the money men are often pulling the strings. But really, Sam, nobody should be going to work and experiencing this kind of risk. It's really quite shocking. And more so when you realise that at least in the United States, and I don't know, to be honest, the position in the UK, but in the United States from the mid-1990s, corporate producers, production companies are not able to be held responsible legally for this kind of corporate manslaughter, although individuals working on sets can be. Surely that needs to change.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And it's heartbreaking. Nobody should go to work and lose their life, regardless of the industry they're in. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. And I mean, what do you say? It's someone has lost their life. A couple of wee kids have lost their mum, and that shouldn't happen. And hopefully they get to the bottom of it and put more. I don't know. I don't really know much about the film industry and how it works at that level. Whether it's more safety checks, I don't know. But surely, there should be a corporate manslaughter for the company it's behind it. It seems to be that once again the money men are getting away. With this, and they're the ones that control the purse strings. And if shortcuts are getting made through pressure coming from above, then they need to be held responsible, and they need to be accountable for this as well. It's not just somebody going and having an accident and being off work for a wee while. That's somebody that's lost their life. You can't replace a lost person. That's it's. I just don't know. There needs to be changes. There needs to be changes. But my heart goes out to.
It will be interesting to see whether or not there is a kind of union backlash. As I say, in the United States, crews and creatives are more highly unionised than they are in this country. I don't know why that should be the concern. But sticking on the tragedy of losing your life at work, Carol, you're the first MP I've been able to speak to since the tragic death of your colleague who was stabbed. That must have sent shockwaves around other MPs, all elected representatives. We know that you're very exposed and you're in the open. Do you think things will change? What's the general feeling amongst your colleagues at Westminster in terms of your own personal safety? And I'm not asking you to give us any information about changes you'll be making to your own engagement with the public, but how has this left people feeling in Westminster?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, Westminster was a strange place last week, and I think it will be again this week. It's a really somber atmosphere. Everyone's shocked. We've lost a colleague, and I know, we might joke about Tories or Labour or whoever it might be, but you've got to remember that actually to get anything done in Westminster, you have to work on a cross-party basis. So you end up developing friendships across the benches, and that's not often seen on TV, of course, or in the media, but actually we have lost a colleague, and it's a pretty kind of somber atmosphere just now in Westminster. In terms of security, no, there's not nearly enough done for MPs' security. I've got enhanced measures in my home and in my office, and once you're in Westminster itself, it's extremely secure. But if you're out and about in the community, how do any elected representatives keep themselves safe? It is pretty. It's a difficult thing to do, but I don't think we are taking it seriously enough. The other thing, of course, that we're not taking seriously enough is the abuse that not just MPs or other politicians get on social media, but anybody really in the public eye gets a certain level of abuse on social media, and we just excuse it as it comes with the territory. You need to get a thick skin. So that's something we very definitely need to look at, I would say, in the months ahead.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, on that note, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you both very much for joining me. I suspect as we get nearer COP26, it will continue on our agenda, and we'll be looking at it from a whole list of different angles, from local activism, from what's happening in communities, as well as looking at the bigger picture. Let's hope we don't have any horrific stories to report as a result of COP26 coming to Glasgow. There are a number of fringe events happening around the city, so there is something for people to get involved in, even if you're not going to be a delegate at the conference. I don't think ordinary people are able to get into the conference, although I don't know. We finish the programme, as we always do, with a reminder that it takes money to make the programmes that we make here at Broadcasting Scotland. So if you've enjoyed today, if you think there is a place in Scotland for independent broadcasting that gives stories from a slightly different angle than you get in the mainstream press, then please consider supporting us. The address is on the screen. Go online and make a donation, a regular donation, to help keep us going. It's always extremely welcome. It just leaves me to say have a very pleasant Sunday. It's a lovely day here in Glasgow. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the country. Get your shoes on, go out for a walk and breathe the fresh air while we still have it. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you.